The old man was walking down Fairfax Avenue just after noon, hands behind his back, moving slowly in his worn brown coat, the collar turned up more out of habit than need, and the brim of his faded Dodgers cap casting a shadow over eyes that had once seen too much. He wasn't bothering anyone, just walking, maybe thinking about lunch, maybe remembering a time when the city felt smaller, maybe just trying to keep his knees from locking up. And then from behind, like they'd dropped out of the sky, a group of four boys in hoodies and sneakers swarmed him. Teenagers, maybe, young enough to think the world owed them something. One of them grabbed at the man's arm, another went straight for the canvas shoulder bag he carried, the one with the frayed strap, and the little faded one, first airborne patch stitched near the zipper, and they started yanking it, laughing, shouting something he couldn't catch, and he stumbled back, confused at first, too slow to react, too shocked to do anything but hold tight. But the boy was stronger and tore the bag from him, the force of it pulling the old man down onto one knee on the sidewalk, his palm scraping the concrete as he reached for balance and missed. And for a moment he was just there on the ground, one knee bent, head down, watching their sneakers scatter as they ran. One of them looking back to grin like it was a game, like they'd won something. Not knowing what they'd taken was just a few small things. The money, yes, a couple hundred in cash he'd just withdrawn from the ATM for rent and groceries. But also something else. Something he didn't even realize was gone until a minute later, when he pushed himself up and checked the bag's contents in his head, and remembered the small black and white photograph he kept in an envelope in the side pocket, the one from Vietnam. Two boys crouched in tall grass with cigarettes in their mouths and helmets tipped back, and the idea that it was gone hit him harder than the fall, harder than the skinned palm or the stiff ache in his hip, harder than the realization that no one had stepped in, that people had just watched it happen from the patio of the cafe across the street. Some with phones in their hands, but not a single call made to help him. He stood up slowly, checked his coat for tears, wiped the blood from his hand onto his pants, and looked down the street where the boys had disappeared like ghosts into the city, swallowed by it in seconds, and then he just started walking again, this time slower, not because of the pain, but because of the weight of what he'd lost, heading nowhere in particular until instinct or muscle memory or maybe just the desire for a moment of quiet brought him to a small cafe he used to visit with an old friend from the Marines. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths and dusty ceiling fans that never turned, and he pushed open the door and sat down at the corner booth like he always used to, like it hadn't been almost a year since the last time. And the girl behind the counter didn't recognize him, but nodded politely, and he just sat there for a while, breathing slowly, letting the noise of the street fall away behind the glass. And then a man in a leather jacket with gray stubble and the same eyes sat down across from him without a word, just a nod that said everything. And after a minute, the old man opened his mouth, not to complain, not to vent, but just to say that something had happened. And when he was finished, the man nodded again and said he knew some people who might want to hear about it, that maybe it was time they reminded the city that some men didn't get small just because they got old. And they sat there for a long time, not planning revenge, not threatening anyone, but remembering what it was like to have each other's backs in places where nobody else would. And outside, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk where the scuffed outline of a fallen man was still faintly visible in the dust. He didn't know what to do, not really, not in the way that someone younger might pull out a phone and blast their outrage into the world for 100 hearts and shares, because for him there was no instinct to record, no reflex to complain, just an ache in his ribs and a quiet sense of violation that stuck like a cold hand on the back of his neck. So he walked, not because he had somewhere to go, but because he didn't. And eventually his feet brought him to the old cafe on La Cienega, where the curtains were still the same faded green, and where the jukebox in the back still had a quarter stuck in the same track. And as he walked in, his hand pressed lightly to the bruise under his coat, he spotted a familiar figure at the end booth, the kind of man who sat with his back to the wall not out of paranoia but habit, big hands folded over a chipped coffee cup, eyes narrowed from years in sun and sand. And when the veteran sat down across from him without a word, the other man nodded once and waited, as if he already knew something had happened, and slowly, carefully, the story came out. The sidewalk, the boys, the bag, the photo. And when it was over, the friend didn't speak for a while. Just looked out the window at the traffic with a tight jaw and the kind of stillness that only men who've seen real chaos can hold. And finally, he said he'd call a few people. Not the kind who asked questions, but the kind who remembered what a pact meant. And the veteran just nodded, unsure if he felt more comfort or shame, unsure if he wanted them caught or if he just wanted the memory of it erased. But later that evening, when the sun dipped low and the street lamps blinked on like tired eyes, he met up with his friend again, this time outside a closed tire shop near where it had happened. And one by one, other men showed up. None of them young, none of them flashy, just quiet presences with weathered faces and a certain way of standing that made it clear they weren't there for talk. And together they moved back to the spot where it had happened, standing silent under the hum of the neon bodega sign, watching, waiting, not with violence in their eyes, but with a kind of heavy patience. And eventually, hours in, when it seemed the night would pass uneventfully, the boys showed up again. Same clothes, same swagger, laughing loudly as they passed on scooters and skateboards, oblivious, or maybe just fearless. And the veterans didn't rush them, didn't shout, just watched until the group slowed near the corner, and then one of them turned and recognized the old man standing by the pole with the bent cap and tired eyes, and something about that recognition froze him for half a second. But not long enough, because by then they were moving, not fast, not clumsily, but with the kind of purpose that made the boys hesitate, made them look around for exits they hadn't thought about needing. And when the tallest one started to run, the others followed. But the veterans were already spreading out, not chasing like kids on adrenaline, but following like wolves, methodically, letting the panic do half the work, cornering them near an alley behind the laundromat where the broken glass sparkled under the streetlight and the dumpsters leaned like crooked teeth. And when they had, the boys stopped, panting, wild-eyed, surrounded. No one threw a punch, no one raised a hand, they just stood there. The oldest one stepping forward slowly and asking, in a low voice that carried like a drumbeat, if they knew what it meant to take something that wasn't just money. And the boys didn't speak, didn't blink, and for a second it seemed like nothing would happen. But then the youngest one, the one who'd actually taken the bag, reached into his backpack and pulled it out slowly, like it burned to touch, and held it out with shaking fingers, eyes not on the man he'd robbed, but on the circle of quiet anger closing around him. And just as the bag changed hands, headlights swung into the alley, harsh and sudden, and a voice on a speaker barked at them to freeze. Someone had called the police, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone from the rooftop above. And within seconds, blue and red lights filled the space like a siren's breath. Officers jumping out with hands on holsters and confusion in their eyes as they saw the strange tableau. A group of elderly men, solemn and silent, facing off with a group of kids who looked like they'd seen ghosts. And it took a minute before anyone spoke, before anyone moved, and when the officer in charge asked what was going on, no one answered at first, until the veteran held out the bag and said simply that it had been stolen earlier, that it had now been returned. And the cop nodded slowly, eyes moving from face to face, like trying to read a book. Without knowing the language, and after a long pause, he said they'd need to come down to the station, all of them, just to make a statement. And the veterans nodded as if it was nothing, as if they'd done this before under different flags in different lands. And as the police cuffed the boys with minimal struggle, and the officers tried to piece together what had happened, the old man looked down at the bag in his hand and opened the side pocket carefully, fingers trembling not from fear, but from hope. And when he found the envelope inside, a little crumpled but still sealed, he let out a slow breath that no one noticed. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the sirens and the shouts and the radios crackling with codes, a city kept moving, oblivious, as if none of it had happened. But something had, and it wasn't over. Not yet. Because as the police drove away and the night settled back into its quiet rhythm, the old man didn't go home, didn't retreat, didn't disappear. Instead, he stayed with the others on the curb, waiting, watching as if they knew something else was coming, something bigger, and all anyone had to do was wait long enough to see it. They caught up with them just past the alley, where the concrete cracked into weeds, and the city forgot to keep things clean, and the boys had nowhere left to run, boxed in by fences and dumpsters, and that terrible, quiet determination of men who had known real fear and wouldn't be rattled by four scared kids with thin arms and big mouths. And it wasn't like they dragged them down or pinned them or shouted. It was worse than that, because they didn't say much at all, just stood close enough that the boys could feel the age and weight of every step, like something ancient moving under the earth. And then one of the men, not the oldest, but the thickest in the shoulders, with a burn scar curling down one forearm, stepped forward and said they had 5 seconds to give back what they stole. That 5 seconds was all they'd get before the cops came and found out how much worse this could be. And he looked at them in a way that made the smallest one start to cry. Not loud, just this quiet tremble in the chest, like an engine choking out. And the boy who'd taken the bag reached into his jacket and handed it over. No words, just a tight jaw and glassy eyes. And he tried to look brave but couldn't meet the veteran's stare. Not when the old man took the bag with that same careful reverence you'd used to hold something that once held blood. And he opened the zipper without even glancing at the boys, his fingers slow and precise, like they remembered something the rest of him tried to forget. And he found the envelope still tucked in the side pouch, bent but unopened. And the moment his fingers closed around it, he let out this breath, like something deep inside unclenched. But he didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't forgive. Not yet. And just then, the sound of tires turning into gravel hit them all at once, and the lights from the squad car painted the alley in blue and red like a cracked memory of an old war movie. And the cops stepped out fast, guns holstered but hands twitching, shouting for everyone to stay where they were. And the veterans didn't move, didn't flinch, just raised their hands a little and backed off from the boys, who were now frozen. Their false courage melted away under the pulsing lights, and one officer barked into his radio, while another demanded an explanation. But it didn't take long to put the pieces together, not when they saw the scratches on the old man's hand and the haunted stillness in his eyes, and not when one of the kids tried to explain something about being dared, about it being a joke. But the officer cut him off and said it didn't matter, that they had witnesses, that the security cam across the street already confirmed the story. And within minutes, the boys were in the back of the car, heads down, their silence louder than their earlier bravado. And the veterans just stood there watching, not smug or angry, just quiet, because they knew this wasn't justice, not really. But it was enough for now, and as the sirens faded down the street, one of the cops came back and said they'd follow up later, maybe get statements, maybe not.